You'd expect, if death were coming, that it might warn you gently. Perhaps in a dream, or in the sudden reappearance of a departed loved one. Your grandmother sitting at the foot of your bed, your childhood dog pacing the hallway. Maybe you'd hear a whisper in a voice that feels like home, some kindness in the silence before the end. But what if the ones who come aren't yours at all? It starts subtly. A figure outside your window that doesn't move when you blink. A stranger's face in a crowded street who pauses and looks at you as though you're all they've ever lost. You'll convince yourself it's nothing. That grief is contagious, that you're just seeing things, but then it happens again, and again. And the expressions on those faces aren't blank. They're broken. They show up a few days before you die. At least, that's what the pattern suggests. People have been reporting them for decades. Silent mourners. People who appear suddenly, stand in silence, and weep. Not with the confusion of a haunting, but the tenderness of someone losing you all over again. They place flowers by your door, leave notes in handwriting you don't recognize. One man claimed a woman hugged him in the middle of the night and called him by a name he'd never heard, but instinctively knew was his. They're not family, not friends, not anyone from this life. That much is certain. Yet they act as if you are the center of their world, as if your death is a catastrophe that will shatter everything they believe in. And the strangest part is what they bring. Old photographs where you're in the background, always blurred but undeniably present. Letters with your name scrawled in the margins. Drawings of your face, but aged or changed in ways that don't match your own mirror. Researchers have dismissed it as mass hysteria, a final hallucination in the dying brain. They say the mind invents comfort in strange forms, even if that comfort wears a stranger's face. But that theory falls apart when others start seeing them too, before you die. Nurses, caretakers, even neighbors. They see the same people. They describe the same grief, and always a deep, unshakable familiarity, like watching someone mourn a version of you they've already lost. Some believe it's reincarnation bleeding through, past lives surfacing to watch the curtain fall once more. Others think it's the soul preparing to shift timelines, and those who grieve you are echoes from a reality you left behind. The more ancient cultures speak of soul witnesses, guardians who track you across lifetimes, only appearing when the end is truly near. Not to take you, but to say goodbye. There's a kind of loneliness to the idea that in your final hours, the ones who cry for you aren't the ones you know, but the ones you could have known. People from another life, a different path, maybe a better one. A version of your story that went a different way. And somehow across the folds of fate and time, they still remember you. And maybe that's what hurts the most. Not that you're dying, but that somewhere someone already did. And they've been waiting a very long time, just to see you go again. If that thought lingers in your mind long after this ends, then you're exactly where you belong. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library, a place where the lost, the cursed, and the almost forgotten are kept alive in story. If something stirred in you tonight, let it be known in the ways that count. The echoes here always listen. The first time Dr. Anjali Suresh saw the pattern, she thought it was a coincidence. A palliative care specialist with over 2 decades of experience, she had seen every form of dying hallucination imaginable. Departed family members, long-lost pets, even moments of intense spiritual lucidity. But this was different. It wasn't what the patients saw that disturbed her. It was what they described. "I keep seeing a woman in a green scarf," one man whispered, just days before passing. "She's crying for me, like she lost me a long time ago." Another patient, a school teacher in her 50s, said a man stood at the end of her bed night after night, clutching a photograph of her as a child. But the photograph, she said, wasn't from her life. It was like he remembered a version of me that never existed. At first, Dr. Suresh dismissed it as the usual neurological haze that settled in near death. But it kept happening. New patients, same descriptions. Different regions, different languages, same mourners. Always one or two figures, always grieving, and never recognized. She began documenting it secretly, compiling what she called the Atlas of the Bereft. Within a year, she had over 70 detailed accounts, all eerily similar. And when she laid the descriptions side by side, the patterns became undeniable. The woman in the green scarf, the man with a gold ring and cracked glasses, a child who hummed a melody no one could place. They appeared across continents, across belief systems, and none of them were ever connected by blood or history. It became stranger still when hospital staff began to report sightings. Orderlies claimed to see people standing in the hallways who vanished as soon as they were approached. Security footage caught flickers of movement near the rooms of patients who would pass within days. One camera captured a woman placing a small candle on the floor outside a room. The flame never lit. The woman never entered. She simply stood there and cried. One night, Dr. Suresh stayed late. A patient, young, just 34, had begun to speak of a father who wasn't his. He said the man visited at night, sat by his bed, and apologized again and again. When she entered the room just after midnight, she smelled something faint in the air, lavender and smoke. The man was asleep, but beside the bed was a small antique locket. Inside it, a photo of a baby. The face was familiar. It was her, not her as a child, her face now, as an infant. And for a moment, Dr. Suresh felt a vertigo so sharp it nearly dropped her to the floor. There was no explanation. No one had access to such a photo. She had never taken one that matched it. And yet, here it was, weathered, ancient, and impossibly real. She didn't tell anyone, not yet. But that moment cracked something open. She began cross-referencing her patient files with missing persons reports, obituaries, even unsolved cases from other countries. A shocking number of her patients bore striking resemblance to people listed as deceased elsewhere. Not exact matches, but close, like siblings or echoes. One case chilled her more than the rest. A man who died in Mumbai described a young girl who stood outside his window every night, holding a paper crane. She never spoke, but her eyes were soaked with grief. When Dr. Suresh showed him a photo of a child from a missing persons file in Denmark, just to test his response, he broke down. "That's her," he sobbed. "That's the one who cries for me." But the timelines didn't match. The girl had vanished 3 years ago. The man had never left India. There was no conceivable link. And yet, something had passed between them, across borders, across stories, maybe even across realities. She published none of it, not because she lacked evidence, but because she feared what it meant. That grief was not limited to the ones we know. That somewhere else, in some fractured mirror of existence, people were losing us and mourning who we might have been. The Atlas of the Bereft was never completed. Dr. Suresh disappeared before she could finish it. Her colleagues found her apartment undisturbed, her notes neatly stacked, and her last patient's chart still open. There was only one unusual detail. On her desk was a hand-drawn portrait of a man no one could identify. He looked to be in his 60s. He wore cracked glasses and a wedding band, and in the corner of the page, in faded ink, she'd written, "He cried like he'd lost me before." Selwyn Vale wasn't a place you found on a map. At least, not easily. Tucked into a forgotten stretch of moorland between Wales and the western borders of England, it was the kind of village that didn't grow so much as settle deeper into the land with each passing decade. There were no signs welcoming you, no petrol stations or pubs, just fog, fences, and the quiet hum of something old clinging to its final breath. In 1974, a journalist named Ada Morrigan went missing while investigating local folklore tied to Selwyn Vale. Before she vanished, she sent a final letter to her editor, never published, never broadcast, about a place where the dead do not wait for the dying, but walk among them in mourning long before the body knows it's ill. The letter was recovered from her typewriter by her landlord. Its content was strange. She spoke of seeing strangers weeping in the lanes, of locals warning her not to speak to the reflections, and of mirrors that didn't show her face, but instead, the faces of people who seemed devastated by her presence. 30 years later, the letter resurfaced in a private archive, and a team of folklore researchers took interest. One of them, an ethnographer named Jules Whitaker, traveled to Selwyn Vale in 2006. He wasn't a superstitious man. He specialized in debunking rural ghost stories, but within days, he stopped sending updates. When he finally returned to London, something in him had changed. He spoke slowly, like each word had to be excavated from somewhere deeper, and he refused to be near mirrors. He claimed he'd seen his own reflection mourning him, not in real time, but older, wearier, dressed in clothes he'd never owned. In the background, figures gathered behind the glass, silent and solemn, watching him through their grief. At first, his colleagues assumed trauma, delusion, but he wasn't alone. Several other researchers had entered the village, and not all of them returned. Those who did had similar stories, encounters with people who addressed them by different names, villagers who claimed to have already buried them, and mirrors, always the mirrors, showing funeral scenes no one had attended. Jules described one event in detail. He had walked past an abandoned church and saw an open coffin through a cracked window. Curious, he entered. Inside, there were no bodies, just dozens of framed photographs lining the pews, all of people who looked like him. But not quite. Variations, a scar in a different place, eyes older, skin weathered, as if the building housed not a funeral, but a eulogy to lives he never lived. There were no locals to question. The population had dwindled so low that the town felt more like a whisper than a home. But one elderly woman spoke to Jules on his last day. She said the village was thin, that the veil there had frayed. Here, the lives you didn't choose don't stay dead, she said. They follow, they grieve, and they wait for you to remember them. When Jules asked what she meant, she pointed to his chest. You feel it, don't you? The weight of 100 forgotten farewells. Every time you almost died, a part of you did. And they buried it. Now they wonder which part you're letting go next. He left that night, said he couldn't sleep in the valley any longer. He claimed the mirrors began to change while he was awake, that the reflection no longer moved when he did, that it began writing on fogged glass, and that the messages weren't in English. The final page in his notes describes a phrase he couldn't read, not from any known language, but when spoken aloud, he said it brought tears to his eyes, though he didn't know why. He ended the entry with a single line. If they're not ghosts, they must be something worse. Not what comes after you die, but what mourns the parts that never got to live. Selwyn Vale has since been blocked off. The land was purchased under a corporate entity with no accessible records. Satellite images now show only mist, an overgrown road, and something glinting faintly among the ruins, like broken mirrors catching light from a sun no longer overhead. In 1949, deep beneath a ruined monastery in the Czech Republic, a series of bunkers was discovered sealed behind iron walls. The monastery itself had long since burned in the war, but the bunkers were untouched, preserved in a silence too deliberate to be accidental. They were lined with blackened mirrors, all turned to face the stone. And on the floor of the largest chamber was a single phrase etched into scorched concrete. Do not remember, what wasn't yours. For decades, the site remained hidden from public knowledge. But in 1987, a military translator named Marek Vondra leaked several documents to a private occult historian in Prague. These reports described psychological experiments on soldiers involving a ritual known only as the crossing. The goal, it seemed, was not communication with the dead, but with the mourners. Participants were isolated in the mirror chamber for 72 hours, surrounded by objects from lives they had never lived, love letters addressed to names they didn't recognize, portraits bearing their face with different scars, uniforms from wars they hadn't fought. After 2 days, most began reporting dreams, but not their own. They spoke in languages they hadn't studied, described places they couldn't have known. And then, on the third night, they began to grieve. One soldier sobbed uncontrollably for a wife he never married. Another recited a lullaby in a dialect long extinct, insisting it was his grandmother's voice. A third claimed to see his own funeral, but not from the casket. He was in the crowd, holding hands with a child who called him father. The official explanation was psychological breakdown. But one recording, captured on a reel-to-reel tape and hidden for decades, tells another story. The voice is male, shaking but clear. She's here again, every night. She cries like she lost me before I was ever born. And last night, she said my name, but not the one I've lived with, the one I never told anyone, the one I gave up. Then, the voice breaks. I think I remember her now. The project was abruptly shut down. Most participants disappeared into classified psychiatric care, but one never resurfaced at all, Lieutenant Viktor Hayek. According to Marek's documents, Hayek performed the crossing alone after hours. He removed the mirrors from the walls and arranged them in a circle, each one facing inward. At the center, he placed a photo torn from an unknown passport. It was of himself, but younger, and smiling. The next morning, the chamber was empty. The mirrors all cracked, and in the middle of the floor, a single item remained: a ring. Simple, silver, inscribed on the inside with words in a dead Slavic tongue. Translated, they read, "I knew you once, before we died." After that incident, a peculiar pattern began to spread across Prague and beyond. People reported strangers approaching them and apologizing in tears. Some left notes in coat pockets. Others simply stood across the street and wept. In every instance, the person affected reported a strange emotion, not fear, but loss. Deep, aching loss for something they couldn't name. In 2003, a girl named Katerina Hayek, no known relation, visited the ruins with a paranormal research group. She stood inside the cracked circle of mirrors and stayed silent for hours. When the team asked what she was doing, she simply replied, "Waiting for someone who remembers me the way I never was." That night, she vanished. Her camera was recovered days later, halfway down a river. The final frame, still intact, showed a man standing just outside the mirror circle. His face was blurred, distorted not by motion, but by something old. Behind him, faintly visible in every reflective surface, were dozens of others, all weeping, all watching her. Some believe the crossing doesn't summon ghosts. It doesn't speak to spirits in the traditional sense. It opens a tear, not into death, but into the versions of ourselves we never became. And through that tear, the ones who loved us still wait, still hope, still mourn. Not because we're gone, but because we left them behind. There's a quiet kind of horror in being remembered by people you've never met. It whispers something we don't like to hear. That maybe this life isn't the only one carrying the weight of our choices. That maybe every decision we didn't make formed a new version of us, one that still breathes somewhere beyond our reach. And in those other lives, We weren't always the ones left behind. We were the ones lost, mourned, buried under names we never answered to, but somehow still wore like skin. The ghosts that appear before death may not be ghosts at all. They don't rattle chains or whisper warnings. They don't show up to frighten or punish. They weep. They kneel. They light candles for a soul that slipped through their fingers in a version of reality we can no longer touch. And their grief is personal. It's the look in someone's eyes when they've finally found what they lost, only to lose it again. It's the hand reaching through glass, not to take you, but to remember you one more time. They don't haunt you because you're dying. They mourn you because you're leaving them behind. Again. Maybe they come from other timelines. Maybe they're fragments from past lives that didn't end cleanly. Or maybe they're just witnesses, keepers of some cosmic obituary where all our forgotten selves are listed side by side, incomplete, but still aching. And maybe that's what death really is. Not an end, not even a passage, but a convergence. A final pull toward the versions of ourselves that still echo through the folds of memory, dream, and fate. So if one day, in the edge of your vision, you see someone crying for you, someone you've never known, don't be afraid. Don't run. You're not being watched. You're being remembered. And the version of you they loved was never ready to let go.